Hi, welcome to How to D&D. My name is Fred Weller, and today I want to talk about the art of film and how it's inspired me when I'm running my Dungeons and Dragons games. So I don't know if many people know, but I have a thing for film. I have a huge room, not a huge room, but I have an office room, and it's full of shelving from the floor to the ceiling, and it's just covered in Blu-rays, DVDs, just movies. I have a thing for movies. I often watch at least one movie every night, and I've been doing that for a long time. And most of the stuff that I do in my games, I pull out of movies. It goes back to me reading books, but I have a real desire and love of film. And my brother knows this, and I got given this book, The Art of Film, not so long ago, because he knows I like fantasy and science fiction, and it's got a whole lot of information in there. Often a lot of films that I've bought specifically because I rewatch them so often, and I use the elements in those stories for my Dungeons and Dragons games. And one of the things I've tended to do with my games is I don't put limitations on what I will do. I have a reputation for running games that get pretty crazy and wacky, and there isn't anything that I wouldn't attempt to do or try and do in my games. So I thought I would have a flick through here and talk to you about sort of what inspires me. I have, as I said, a love for film, but that also comes back to sort of just general artwork, and I have a whole bunch of art books that I have been given over the years, and I store them around the place. I hardly open them up unless I'm actually creating something, and they sit on my shelf, and then I get another book. And all those films, all those elements and characters in the films, I integrate. And the best way I find in terms of integrating film and Dungeons and Dragons is I don't even worry about if it's a fantasy film. Honestly, I've taken elements from Star Wars, we've got Star Wars here, elements of that, and I've inserted it into my game. One of the games that I've done not so long ago was I ran an adventure called Barsoom, which if you have read Edgar Rice, you would know Barsoom is Mars. And I integrated that into my Dungeons and Dragons game, and I had them find some wreckage, a ruined area, and it was the Millennium Falcon. It took them about 3 hours to figure that out, but I had used that as a dungeon location, the ruined Millennium Falcon, and inserted it into the world of, well, basically Mars. And, you know, you don't have to use spaceships and so forth in your adventures, but I always like the idea of incorporating fantasy and science fiction. And so this is why, when I see this sort of stuff, I don't let that be a limitation to what I'll do in my game. And there's a good reason for it. I mean, the images are fantastic. The ideas are not just common, and lots of the ideas from Star Wars, for example, lots of those ideas that were pulled out by George Lucas are from Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom novels. So it's not like this is new material. The only difference that has occurred is that George Lucas has taken the elements of Barsoom and then integrated things like laser swords rather than steel swords, and used a few more spaceships that operate slightly differently, and included a lot of space battles. There's less space battles in the Edgar Rice novels. Even the Jedi is taken from elements to do with Japanese culture. The Time Bandits. I don't know if anybody has ever seen the Time Bandits, and the Time Bandits is one of those films I never really liked that much until I'd watched it a couple of times and fully understood what the heck was going on, because there's so many things going on in that particular movie that it's a little bit hard to follow at times, and it loses its train of thought. You literally, when you think about the Time Bandits, you try to think, well, actually, where is this going? Because it is sort of disjointed. And I think that the best way of incorporating something like a movie into your game is to not necessarily worry about all the linking aspects of it, because you don't have to link everything. I've also used Alice in Wonderland and The Wizard of Oz in my games. I've literally used elements from that as well. This is a famous one, The Dark Crystal. I've got that movie, I've watched it many times, and that's your classic fantasy sort of stuff. I don't know that necessarily the best element in that particular story is the villains, because even though the villains stand out and are probably the focal point for the movie, I always thought it was really clever how he had built a whole lot of societies and little communities, and even the very the fauna and flora in his world, which is it's all puppetry, but it's all live and it all moves. That's what really appealed to me. Even I think it was like a Venus flytrap or some sort of plant creature that sort of tries to swallow one of the little critters running around, and one of the characters. Really nice. This is the sort of stuff that I like to incorporate in my games. And who can't get ideas by looking at art and moving picture? I always thought it was the best way to actually come up with good ideas. When I get stuck, and I do get stuck sometimes, like everybody does, you've got to improvise and come up with a new idea, I'm always thinking about images. Images are easier to describe than coming up with words or phrases that you remember from a book. And so I will think back to a movie or a scene that I've seen in a painting or a picture, and I'll utilize that as a way of describing what's going on. So I'm literally poaching ideas from somebody else. Conan the Barbarian, pretty classic sort of fantasy genre. Don't know that it's necessarily the sort of thing that people really like, but Conan, really the number of Conan movies that so Arnold Schwarzenegger did, he did 2. There really should have been one every 2 years. And I don't know why they didn't think of doing that, because they were actually really cleverly done, even though the second one feels a little bit sort of off. They could have done a series of them really easily, and they would have done really well. And their attempts to sort of bring back Conan haven't worked out that well. But Conan is your classic barbarian, and when it comes to creating a character who's a barbarian, that's what everybody sort of looks back to. They are thinking Conan. Obviously there are other characters that you can pull out, but that's the most iconic character out of all of them. And this is why I use film, because it's all there. You know, when you want to do anything with Dungeons and Dragons, you only have to look at film. I know a lot of people like using music too. I've bumped into a couple of people who say that they really find inspiration by listening to certain music. I'm not really that sort of person. I always liked art and moving picture. Some pretty nasty things going on here. Conan is the unbeatable warrior who steals stuff and has a very active sexual lifestyle. Okay, moving on. Lots of Conan here. The other characters that I really like are, I like westerns, and I tie westerns into my stories quite a lot. People don't realise it, but I have a thing for Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood movies, always liked them. The Magnificent Seven, loved that movie. All of the John Wayne movies, I have a lot of John Wayne movies, far too many. Gremlins is, when you think about the movie, Gremlins is taking all of the myth and ideas that we've ever heard about Gremlins, you know, things that throw a spanner in the works and create strange things. That's the sort of stuff that it's taking that mythology and all of the past history that humans have compiled, and it's bringing it forth and making it sort of relevant now. This is what film does, and truthfully, that's why I always fall back on film rather than on book, because film is usually moving further and faster than all the other mediums, because they can pump out these things in 1 or 2 years. I don't want to really necessarily pump my way through this entire book because it's not really that helpful. June. Now, June is a good example of, I utilised June in my Dark Sun campaign, and I actually built in a worm chase where they had to try and escape a worm. They actually encountered what was some raiders that were going to pretty much wipe them out. They didn't think that that the raiders weren't actually after them, that they were being chased by something else much larger and more dangerous. But I incorporated that into my game using these sandworms from the June movie because I thought it was a fantastic idea. I built a skill check, or skill challenge should I say, for Dungeons & Dragons 4E, and I posted it up online. It's probably one of the most popular skill challenges I've ever put together. In fact, I probably should sort of maybe redo it, update it for Dungeons & Dragons 5e. But Dark Sun and June, I can't think of two worlds that could be any more similar in nature, just in terms of the landscape. And cool little creatures. Ghostbusters. I think people got confused when it came to Ghostbusters because people go on about it being a comedy, and I remember as a kid being terrified. It was a horror, and I think a lot of people got lost in terms of, guess what? We're going to make Ghostbusters even funnier than it was before. When in fact it was a horror, and it was actually quite scary, and it had elements that were funny, but they were really subtle and they were highbrow rather than lowbrow. And you could literally build a campaign around a party who fight ghosts. I think it's a fantastic idea. I haven't actually done it before, but I did run a campaign that revolved around fighting the undead for quite a long time, and I utilised elements of an undead dragon, a sort of a ghoul lord, and a whole bunch of other things. I didn't try to include it like a battle on a flying ship as well. I had a throne that I had pulled out for that particular purpose. The throne idea is pulled directly from the Ghostbusters movie, because that last scene where they have to face the marshmallow, the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, where they make the fatal error of saying that they're not gods. Then I had taken that particular scene and used that as a staging point because I thought that was a really clever idea. Never-ending story. The first one was always the best. It's surprising how ideas like that, and I view the never-ending story as a sort of like that solo adventure where you all want to sort of follow along, and it's a good example of how you can actually run a game and have no combat, literally. If you want a game where it's about skill challenges and overcoming obstacles and role-playing and interacting with other NPCs, Never-Ending Story is like a fantastic example of that. And classic art, classic images, easily pulled out. I mean, who hasn't watched that movie before? I think pretty much everybody has. But yes, and that's why it got so many awards, because it did not focus on combat. And there's nothing wrong with combat. Combat's good, it's fun. Dungeons and Dragons is basically a combat game to a large extent. Most of the book is revolving around, in terms of the rules that is, around combat. And there's a bit of a section on how to cast spell, a bit of a section on making skill challenges and skill checks and ability checks, and maybe a little bit of flavour, but most of it is around mechanics. I'm going to keep flipping through here because I'm looking for another element in here that will illustrate my point. So fantasy worlds don't get any better than that. This is why I use movies. Always a great place to go. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. I know a lot of people don't like the Temple of Doom. I actually thought out of all of them, it was not necessarily the best, but it's got to be one of the more interesting stories, and it certainly tried to push the envelope a lot. And if you want to deal with cultists in your game, I always considered Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom a really good place to go when it came to coming up with the motivations and sort of the look and feel and how that might go about or take place. Can't go any wrong with pulling people's hearts out and throwing them into flaming pits. And the Temple of Doom's got plenty of that. The Labyrinth. Probably the most popular movie that I've come across amongst women who play Dungeons and Dragons. And obviously because the main character is a woman or a young teenager, and it's also, you know, it's kid friendly, and a lot of it isn't killing and death, and yet another example of where, although there is some sort of violent stuff taking place, it's a really good example of you don't have to base your game literally on fights. A lot of it is just about exploration, making your way through a maze, and a magic maze at that. I mean, you can say it's not a magic maze, but it's definitely a magic maze. And dealing with goblins. Level 1 characters deal with goblins all the time. Mars attacks. I've run a game involving abductions, cow mutilations, flying saucers, lights in the sky, all sorts of things like that. And I did that based on Mars attacks, invaders from Mars, the body snatchers, the Terminator. I pulled all of that and I utilised that in my game, and it worked out pretty well. I always thought it was a good idea anyway. Godzilla, giant beasts. I mean, there's your point and call for dragons, and not just any dragon or beast, but you know, really really big ones with all sorts of different things going on. Beast battles. And I've watched too many Godzilla movies. Godzilla versus Mothra is still my favourite, primarily because of the sound effects that come from Mothra in the lava, well, not the lava form, but the caterpillar form. The choo-choo train noises were just hilarious. I thought that was fabulous. I'm going to skip through here because I don't really want to focus on princesses. Here we go. This is our point of call for so many ideas that we pull out for our Dungeons and Dragons games, and that's Lord of the Rings. So I've got all the movies, and I've just recently finished watching Return of the King, and there are so many elements to Lord of the Rings that are really useful, not just imagery, but also just the interplay between it, because it is very much an interplay between multiple characters who have to face a really nasty and deadly threat to the entire world that they reside in. So that's the reason why I use film. It makes perfect sense to me. My players, do you know the giant eagles? The eagles are coming. I can't count the number of my times my players, particularly at high level, will say, Fred, we don't care what you do, but we want giant eagles, because giant eagles fix everything. And yes, they spent a good portion of their time flying around on giant eagles, and it didn't solve all their problems, but it certainly solved a lot of them. And that's pulled directly from Lord of the Rings. And here we go. I'm going to skip through a lot of this because that's not Hellboy. I don't know that I've used any elements from Hellboy in any of my games, but apart from the tentacled creature, the Chaos Gods, that's probably the only element that I've ever utilised in any of my games. And I don't think I did that for very long. mainly because I think it was too big a threat for them to manage at the level they were at. Narnia. I mean, it's a huge... I skip Narnia because I'm never really that fond of Narnia, truthfully. Never really enjoyed it as much as other stories. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I've been watching this movie for years. The one that was originally made for the chocolate bar. That was the reason they made it, for a chocolate bar. I don't think I've actually ever included it in a Dungeons and Dragons game. Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. Now, the Harry Potter movies, this is probably one of the few reasons why my partner agreed to actually play in a game of Dungeons and Dragons, was the Harry Potter. She loved Harry Potter. She'd watched all the movies, read all the books, and so the opportunity to play Dungeons and Dragons and sort of replicate that was right up there. And as soon as the mechanics came into play, it was like, no, it's too much. But that was her interest in it, and it was a nice segue into it, a nice way to introduce her and get her going. It's just a shame I was not able to make it easy enough for her to understand. But you know, we're playing late at night, and she's not as geeky as me or my friends, so she's not really quite as interested in that sort of stuff. So mechanics late at night and adding stuff up and figuring stuff out, and she was never into that.